Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I am joined by Martin Refalo from JPS Health and Fitness. He's been pursuing his PhD, where he's investigating the relationship between muscle hypertrophy and the proximity to failure. And he's been on the podcast before talking about this, where we talked about his scoping review. He's also been on a meta-analysis that was also published, and since then also part of a team that looked at a meta-regression. And so there's been lots of information coming out about RAR and proximities to failure as it pertains to muscle hypertrophy and also fatigue. And he's actually been conducting a very well conducted study investigating this, where he had participants training one leg using a failure protocol, another leg using a proximity to failure protocol or an RAR, and investigated the proximity to failure relationship on muscle hypertrophy. And I think there's lots of things that we dig into in this podcast about the methodologies and those sort of things that make this a really, really valuable discussion that you can take forward with your own education in terms of when you read and interpret studies, and how to take that on board to feed into your own protocols and philosophy moving forward. And as a reminder, guys, if you find these podcasts valuable, please make sure to subscribe if you haven't, so you don't miss another episode. Please give us a like or a review. It's always helpful. And also comment if you're over on YouTube, because it helps us grow as a podcast. So thank you so much. But without further ado, let's get into the show. Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Martin Refalo back on the show. It's actually a while since we spoke last time, Martin. It doesn't feel like that long has passed, but it was 9 months ago. So September last year, we were talking, it was episode 327, if people want to reference that and go back, because you might want to after this chat here. And we were talking about this scoping review that you kind of published. We were just looking at the impact of proximity to failure on hypertrophy and some fatigue outcomes. And that's kind of been in vogue. I mean, it's always in vogue over the last few years, at least in like the evidence-based kind of bodybuilding scene, and failure versus not, high intensity versus volume, these sort of things. And the really cool thing is you're actually nearly completing your PhD, and you're really investigating kind of proximity to failure and its impact on its impact on hypertrophy. That's like your main interest. So you've recently kind of been looking into that deeper, and we're going to be digging into that. But how has the last kind of few weeks been for you, kind of gathering all that data, and how's kind of thinking about last time we came on and what's changed since then? Like, has it been interesting for you? Or I'm very interested to know what's going through your head with everything that's been going on within kind of the industry.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be back here, Steve. So thanks for inviting me back on. You're right. I'm nearly finished my PhD. I think I've been thinking about, RIR and hypertrophy every day for probably the past, 2 years, and I'm looking forward to getting it done. You're right. Last time we spoke, we touched on the scoping review. So that was my first contribution to the research when it comes to this topic. And since then, we've come quite far. I've published, I think, another 3 research papers and been involved in some as well, like the recent meta-regression. And it has been very cool to be a part of this process, providing, interesting and novel insights into this area of research. I think it's a very promising time for exercise science as we learn, new ways to do things, whether that's through statistical analysis or designing studies themselves. I think studies are only improving in their design and in their ability to be generalized and transferred to practical application. So yeah, at this point, I have just finished the first round of data collection for my final PhD study. So it's really all leading up to this last study, where I really try to fill in some of the gaps that we have in the research. As we spoke about in the last podcast that you touched on earlier, the scoping review was all about voicing concerns of the current literature, the gaps that we have and what needs to be done to improve the research, the studies that are designed, but also the interpretations that we can get from research. From then, I went on to publish the meta-analysis towards the end of last year, which we had touched on in that podcast as well. From there, I published a study that looked at the influence of proximity to failure on fatigue. Right, so that was one of the first studies to actually use an RIR-based approach and look at differences between specific RIRs. The recent meta-regression, I think, has also been a talking point as of late, and I'm very privileged to have been involved in that as well. So that was a very interesting exploration of the current literature. Keyword there being exploration. It wasn't designed to be confirmatory, so we can't really come to any concrete conclusions specific to the influence of given RIR values on muscle hypertrophy. So, based on the conversations I've had, I think some people are under the impression that we have addressed the research limitations with this meta-regression, but we haven't really done that. And Zach did a great job on the Revive Stronger podcast not long ago, speaking about how there are limitations to the data that we used, right? The limitations are baked into the data set, and we tried our best to explore the dose-response relationship between RIR and muscle hypertrophy. And Zach, said it really well. He said, look, at this point, all we can say really is that as sets are terminated close to failure, muscle hypertrophy seems to increase. But beyond that, we can't really make any conclusions again about the specific effect of RIR on hypertrophy. And that's a really important point. And I think for anyone out there who still maybe struggles to connect the dots between some of these papers, I think it's important to go back and read some of the previous literature. So I think, for example, my scoping review would be prerequisite reading for the meta-regression, because it speaks about some of the research limitations, the ambiguity, the variability and proximity to failure in non-failure conditions that we tried to estimate in the meta-regression, and we did, but we are likely inaccurate. How inaccurate we aren't exactly sure. There's pros and cons to each approach you decide to take. Pros and cons to the meta-analysis that I generated last year, pros and cons to the meta-regression. And so I think it's really important at this point, with all these new research studies being published and coming to the forefront, it's important we continue to look at the totality of the research, and we don't equate a justified true belief with the last study that we came across. I think the best look at this topic still comes from zooming out and looking at the pros and cons of each study, each analysis, and trying to use clues that each of these analyses provide to come to an interpretation and a potential practical application that works for you or your clients. We spoke about this last time, Steve. We spoke about how, when we're reading research and we're trying to apply it practically, we have to use an interpretive framework and not just take research findings at face value. So that's what's going through my head. And like I said, I think it's a very promising time in exercise science, because studies are only getting better. We're starting to get a deeper look into many topics that have been spoken about for a long time now. And we just have to keep all these important things in mind when we're scrolling through Instagram and a new study pops up, right? We can't just take those headlines at face value. We need to ensure that we're reading the studies and we're reading the conclusions, but we're also overlaying that understanding on the prior information that we have built, right, over the previous years with all the other work that has been done as well. So At this point, I'm running the only study to my knowledge really that is using an RIR based approach to set termination as you would in your own training to reliably look at muscle hypertrophy. And based on the conversations I've had with some people, many are under the impression that this has already been done based on maybe how people speak about, study results and how things look on social media, for example, where there usually is a lack of detail and nuance that sometimes misses the forest for the trees and is not a true reflection of the original document, whether it's a research paper or a podcast that was put out. So I'm looking forward to having a chat about the study that I'm currently conducting, and hopefully people appreciate the lengths that I've gone to here to try and design a study that we can all resonate with if we use RIR in our own training.
I think that was really, really well said. And the point I really liked that you raised was kind of when new data is coming out, not forgetting everything else that has already been published, because I think some people maybe, I mean, you'll get the person who will just, they cherry pick. They might, I don't know, favor RER, and so they'd like cherry pick your kind of previous meta-analysis and scope and review that kind of maybe suggested there wasn't such a big difference between failure training and not. And then if they're like pro failure training, they're going to go to the meta-regression and be like, no, this is the way to do it. And I imagine both those people haven't even probably dug into either of those papers. And actually, like you just mentioned there, I think a lot of people are under the impression that it specifically has had studies, and several studies, comparing exactly what you just said, how we use RAR in practice versus training to failure, when actually, like you've just mentioned, you've literally, or you're in the process of conducting the first one there. And yeah, you did a great job, I think, of outlining all those limitations in your kind of scope and review, with like no consensus of even what failure was. I think a lot of people weren't truly aware of that, but even myself included. And I think a lot of people in practice call like zero RAR failure. And it's like, well, is that, or is it not? It's kind of a bit like it's voluntary failure. And then even like the proximity to failure being unclear in terms of like, again, the speed of repetitions being used in some instances and then others not, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm very excited to talk about this study. And so I guess starting with maybe the kind of title and what you kind of were looking to investigate, I guess we can start from there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I don't have a title yet, but we'll get there eventually.
Maybe that's why I didn't have one here.
That's right. So I'm trying to design a study that, Steve, you can read through and, like I said before, resonate with in regards to your own training. I want to design a study that fills the gaps that I've spoken about, in previous podcasts and in some of my previous work. And, with the help of my team, I think we've gotten to a point where we have a very strong design. Like I said, I've finished the first round of data collection. I have some preliminary results, which we're going to touch on today. And I'm going to try and speak about some of the key points that I think people who are interested in hypertrophy research should be aware about and should keep in mind going forward when they do read other research studies. I'm trying to almost bulletproof the study that I'm currently conducting. And of course, there's always going to be some limitations. We can't cover all bases, but really trying my best here, really trying to provide, a novel insight into how RIR specifically influences hypertrophy. So this is an 8-week unilateral study design. And what this means is participants performing resistance training with their lower limbs, but each limb is randomly allocated to a different training protocol. Now, this is a very strong design for hypertrophy research, the unilateral design. Basically, what we're doing here is we're virtually doubling the sample size that I may have. So, for example, so far I've recruited 9 participants. but I'm actually going to have 18 data points, right? Because each participant is training both of their legs, but their legs are assigned to a different protocol. So in the case of this study, one limb will be performing resistance training to momentary failure, right? All their sets to momentary failure. The other limb will be performing all their sets to a specific RIR. Now, this is where the novelty comes into play. So the RIR limb will be predicting their reps in reserve to control set termination, as you would, Steve, when you are going through your own training sessions. So this will help fill some of the research gaps, because the goal is to try and maintain the same RIR across all sets. Right now, in previous research that we had to use in the meta-regression, for example, and in these previous research studies, we use them to estimate RIR. Basically, in most of the studies, the RIR likely changed from set to set due to fatigue, because it wasn't really anything that the researchers or the participants were really paying attention to. Steve, if I allocated you a set and rep prescription of, let's say, 4 sets of 8 reps with 75% of your 1 rep max, across all sets, right, if you're just stopping at 8 reps, the RIR is likely going to change. You're likely going to accumulate some fatigue. It might decrease as the sets go on. And, not only is that the case, but across participants within the same group, we're likely going to see different RIRs being reached as well. Because, for example, if you could do 12 reps to failure with 75% of your 1 rep max, then technically stopping at 8 reps would be 4 reps in reserve. But I, for example, might be able to do 14 reps to failure with 75% my 1 rep max, which means stopping at 8 reps would actually be 6 reps in reserve. So not only in the case of previous research studies do we have a within individual variability in the RIR achieved across sets, we also have between individual variability. And then that changes from study to study as well. And basically in the meta-regression, we have to assign one RIR value to each group. And hopefully you're starting to build a bit of a picture as to how that is limited, but it is the best we can do with the literature we have, right? So something to keep in mind there. And what I'm trying to do with my study is ensure that participants are controlling RIR on their own accord from set to set, trying to keep it constant. So with all that said, the RIR leg will have a specific RIR target that they are trying to reach, and they terminate their set on their own accord when they think they've gotten to that RIR target. Now, in the case of this study, it's a lower body study, which means we'll be training the legs, like I said, and the exercises I've chosen are the leg press, so the 45-degree leg press, and the leg extension, okay, 2 commonly employed exercises. They're both relatively easy to push to failure in the sense that there's little technical concerns. So, a leg press is likely a better suited exercise to this sort of study design than a squat, for example, where there's a whole host of other demands that need to be considered. So those are the exercises that were chosen for this study, and the RIR leg was assigned a 2 RIR target on the leg press, so terminating sets once an individual perceived to be at 2 RIR. And on the leg extension, the target was a 1 RIR. So still pretty hard training. But what I'm interested in here is trying to investigate the nature of the relationship between RIR and hypertrophy as we get closer to failure. So Steve, I think most people agree that there is a difference between, let's say, training to a 6 RIR and to a 2 RIR, or to failure, right? And we see that in the meta regression. We see the trajectory is increasing as sets are terminated closer to failure, less so with heavier loads, but that's generally the case. But at the top end there, right, is there a difference between pushing to failure and even just keeping 1 or 2 reps in the tank? That's what I'm trying to investigate. Now, of course, that meta-regression showed that there was a difference between train to failure and 0 RIR and 1 RIR. But when you consider that the ground we're standing on with that meta-regression is a little shaky, and like I said, the limitations render any claim specific to given RIR values unreliable and likely inaccurate, right? So again, all we can say there is that, hey, as we push closer to failure, hypertrophy tends to increase, but because of the estimation process and the limitations of literature as a whole, we're still not exactly sure about the exact nature of that relationship as it pertains to specific RIR values. So I think with this study design, we're going to have an insight into what's happening, at the top of that relationship when we're getting really close to failure, right? So the RIR leg was still hard training. The failure leg was obviously hard training. And obviously I'll be looking at the differences between the legs. Now, you might ask, for example, well, is there like a cross education effect between the legs? Like, does training one leg potentially hypertrophy the other? And that doesn't seem to be the case. So, for example, neuromuscular properties may transfer from limb to limb. So building strength in one leg, for example, may transfer to some strength in the other leg, but hypertrophy doesn't seem to take place. Hypertrophy doesn't seem to work like that. So the molecular signaling that leads to hypertrophy seems to be quite local. You might also ask, well, what about the hormonal increases post-training, right, that potentially lead to hypertrophy? And that's an interesting question as well, but post-exercise elevations in hormonal concentration don't seem to be a major influencer of hypertrophy. So, train to failure in one leg and the subsequent hormonal response likely isn't going to affect the hypertrophy seen in the opposing leg. So again, the unilateral design is quite a strong design when looking at muscle hypertrophy as an outcome. So that's the rough study design. The training duration will be 8 weeks. Participants will be coming in to train twice per week. And another interesting talking point is volume, right? People speak about volume a lot and how many sets participants perform in certain studies. And what I did as part of this study was I individualized the volume. So to each participant based on the volume they were completing in the months leading up to the study. And this is another important point because let's say, Steve, you were performing 15 sets for your quads and per week, and you signed up to my study, and the generic set volume allocation was 8 sets per week for all participants, right? You would probably experience some sort of a detraining effect because you're going from 15 sets down to 8 sets, right? Whereas some people who might only be doing a few sets for their quads, they're going to get boosted up to 8 sets, and that might either be too much for them to handle, or it might promote a very robust hypertrophy response. Either way, because individuals are coming into the study with a different training background, that's going to influence how they respond to the volume. So basically, the number of sets that participants were doing leading into the study was used to inform the number of sets they did during the 8 weeks. So if you were doing 15 sets for your quads across the week, Steve, you'd come in and you'd continue doing 15 sets. And we added 20% to that number halfway through the study. So a 20% increase in volume halfway through the study. So that's how it was set up. And when it comes to the participant characteristics, I think this is also an important consideration, as many previous research studies are conducted, have been conducted in untrained individuals. I'm currently recruiting resistance trained individuals. I've had 9 who have completed the first round of the study with an average training experience of about 8 to 9 years. And 6 of them have competed in strength and or physique sports. So quite a highly trained sample. And, going into the study, I was hoping that they were all going to experience some hypertrophy in the 8-week period. And they all did, which we're going to get to soon. Despite it being quite a small amount of hypertrophy, they all grew to some extent, which is pretty cool. And yeah, that's how the study is looking at the moment. And hopefully, if you're listening and paying close attention to some of these points, you're starting to build a bit of a picture as to how this study it's what we sometimes call ecologically valid, right? What this means is it's a study design that we could easily implement in practice, right? And a lot of people currently implement this type of training in practice. Another consideration that I think is worth mentioning is that throughout the 8-week period, participants had to track their nutritional intake. Now, this is not a trivial point, because if we're not tracking nutritional intake, especially in a resistance trained sample, and participants aren't in a calorie surplus, that in itself is going to be a confounder, right? Being in a calorie surplus, yes, it's not mandatory to build muscle, but it's likely going to be supportive, especially if we're talking about resistance trained individuals. So I teamed up with the guys from MacroFactor, and all participants had to track their nutrition with MacroFactor. And if you're not familiar with the way MacroFactor functions, you can set it up to be basically an automated coach. So you can plug in the rate of gain that you're after, or the amount of weight that you want to gain over a certain period, and it will attempt to coach you to that goal. And that's what we did. So the goal was about 1% increase in weight gain per month. And across the 8-week period, the average increase in body weight was about 2 kilos for the whole sample, which indicates they were all in a calorie surplus. Some people found it a bit easier to gain weight than others, but the nutritional intervention there was designed in a way to be supportive of muscle growth. And I think that's a really important point as well. I think the one thing that I didn't mention earlier as well is that with the unilateral study design, so the fact that I'm getting each individual to train both of their legs, and I'm assigning one leg to each of the protocols, that also takes care of many other factors that may influence muscle hypertrophy. So, Steve, we know genetics play a large role, sleep, stress, all these other factors that can come into play. Basically, you can think of me as comparing one of your legs, Steve, to the other. So I'm comparing your left leg to the right leg. And, that takes care of your genetics, the amount of sleep you're having, your stress levels, all of those things. Whereas if I was comparing you directly to me, different genetics, different stress levels, different nutrition, all these other factors that can confound that comparison. So again, when you're reading hypertrophy research, it's important to look out for these important aspects of a study design that can make a study, quite robust in its methods, and potentially a study that we should put more stock into versus others. And with meta-analysis, we can't really weight studies differently based on some of these factors. So we can weight studies based on their sample size. So, for example, studies with a larger sample size, for example, in a meta-analysis, can have a larger influence on the overall pooled effect size that the meta-analysis generates. But we can't really look into these other factors of a study design that plays such a large role. And again, that's what I'm trying to do here, so that we can be somewhat confident in the results that we're obtaining, or at least more confident than we have been from some of the previous research.
I think that was so well said, Martin, and you covered so many great points, lots of ones of which I wanted to touch on, and there is more. I think ecologically valid was basically a great statement in that when I was reading through this study, when you kind of sent across the bits, I was like, you're controlling for everything. That whenever I look at what people have in the comment section and they have complaints about studies, and they're completely fine complaints in terms of like genetics and not being trained and diet, you controlled for all of these. One of the ones that I thought was great that you went into as well was people often are upset with, okay, momentary muscular failure, that's objective, fair enough. But what about these RARs? Can we be confident that your participants were achieving a 2 or 1 RAR, and you had a familiarization period, and you had them, they already had experience of one-on-one coaching, kind of calling out intra-set RARs. So I'd love to hear how you were confident in their RARs during this study as well.
Yeah, great question, Steve. So I don't exactly know how accurate my participants were during the intervention itself. And let's face it, you don't even know how accurate you are when you're training. Yes, sometimes you push to failure and you can test yourself. But in the context of this study, during the 8-week period, we didn't really have the chance to do that. However, in the week leading up to the study itself, I did test the participants. So I put them through, my standard RIR testing process, where they had to push to failure on the leg press, and they had to call out when they thought they were at either a 1 or a 3 RIR on 2 separate sets. And that enabled me to basically see where the sample was at in regards to their RIR accuracy. Now, keep in mind, all of the participants had experience with RIR or RPE in their previous training. They'd all been training for a while. They'd all trained to failure. So with considering that, I hypothesized that they would be pretty accurate. And again, that's why I recruited a highly trained sample in the first place. And with those tests, what I found was that participants on average were 0.3 and 0.25 reps away from the target 1 and 3 RIR respectively. Now, what this means is that they were less than half a rep away from the target RIR, right? So we've got 1 rep, 0.5 would be half a rep. They were at 0.3 and 0.25 on average. Okay, so most participants landed when they were shooting for a 1 RIR. They would have either got the 1 RIR, maybe it would have been a 2, maybe it would have been a 0, maybe they overshot. And in the context of the 3 RIR, most predictions would have been anywhere in between 2 to potentially 4, with no predictions taking place outside of those bounds. So that goes to show that the participants were quite accurate with their RIR predictions going into the study. And I do have some research that should be published soon showing that even on the bench press exercise, resistance trained individuals can be quite accurate with very similar scores to the ones that I'm describing here. And that gives me confidence, and it should give the reader confidence as well, that throughout the intervention, hopefully the RIR predictions weren't too far away from the targets that I had set for set termination. So again, this is an important element of the study design that is absent in previous research, right? We do have research studies that are set up to assess RIR accuracy, and I basically did a mini study before the training intervention actually kicks off. So that's where participants were at pre-study, and of course that familiarization period also gave the participants a chance to actually push to failure, right, and see what that's like. So basically they pushed to failure for 9 weeks consecutively. If you consider the first week plus the 8-week period, or at least one leg pushed to failure for the 9 weeks straight. But that will be reported in the paper, and again will give insight into the overall RIR accuracy of the participants going into the study. But of course, during the intervention itself, we don't exactly know how accurate they were.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and I think I just had Jake Remmett on the show, and he was looking at he was comparing untrained to trained individuals on RAR accuracy, and it just seemed everyone seemed to be relatively accurate. So even with untrained participants, like people kind of have a decent enough gauge on that. And I guess unless someone's hitting momentary failure, you don't know how close they were, and if they weren't at 2 or 1, they were further from failure. So that's kind of if you're going to interpret any sort of way, you think, okay, the results are like they're even further from there. And because these people were trained participants, some of them competitors and things, I'm assuming they're also doing some other training alongside this. How did you kind of make sure that that wasn't interfering with the results that you were trying to derive?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons that I chose the quadriceps as a muscle to train and to measure. I think if I was to choose the biceps, for example, the triceps, and I employed a study design that involved bicep curls and tricep pushdowns, and I measured growth in those respective muscles, there's a whole host of other exercises that can influence growth in those specific muscles. However, when we're talking about the quadriceps, the number of additional exercises that aren't specifically targeting the quads that can influence quad growth is much, much smaller, right? So as part of the study, participants were not performing any additional quadriceps training, so they only performed the quadriceps training that I prescribed as part of the study. They were still able to train their hamstrings and their glutes, but they weren't allowed to perform any exercises like deadlifts, for example, that do involve the quadriceps. They weren't allowed to perform step-ups, for example. You could argue that someone is doing glute-focused step-ups, but the quadriceps are always going to play some sort of a role there. So we did have a list of exercises that participants were unable to perform to ensure that we reduced the chances of any additional training that was being performed outside of the study influencing the overall results that we were seeing. Because you're right, Steve, right? All these individuals were training 4-5 days a week, and designing a study is hard in the sense that you want to try and reduce participant burden. So you don't want to make things too restrictive, or else people just won't sign up, because let's face it, you want to maximize your training. 8 to 10 weeks is a lot of time to potentially compromise on some areas of your training. So they did their quad training with me. They were limited in regards to some of the other exercises they could do, but beyond that, they were still able to perform their own training without too much of an issue there at all. So that's what we did to control any additional influence from the other training that they were performing.
Fantastic. From viewing it myself and talking it through with you here, I can't think of anything else you really could have done to make the results any more valid. Is there anything in hindsight that you could think that you wish you'd done, or are you pretty happy with how kind of you set everything up, and you're going to be pretty confident in the results?
Yeah, I think the one thing that stood out in the early stages of the study that will be reported is the frequency of niggles and injuries that did pop up. So I'm not sure if we spoke about this on the previous podcast, Steve, but I don't think we did. But in the study I conducted last year that looked at the influence of fatigue, RIR on fatigue, the initial plan was to include both the leg press and the bench press. Now, the bench press was fine, and I had 4 participants off the top of my head that started the study with the bench press and the leg press, but I think it was 2 or 3 out of the 4 or 5 participants that I had that actually got injured from the leg press, and that forced me to exclude the leg press from the study. Now, there's a few reasons that probably led to some of those injuries last year. And this year, I implemented not just that 1 week familiarization period before the study started, but before that week, I had participants doing some leg press for at least 4 weeks leading into the study to try and acclimatize them to the protocols. But injuries and niggles still popped up. So one individual had to drop out because of an injury, a strain in the quad. Other people were complaining about some slight niggles here and there. And I think this could potentially be due to the load progression that I implemented in the early stages of the study. So basically the way it worked, Steve, is the leg press was assigned to an 8 to 10 rep max load, right? So in the familiarization week, I tested each individual's 8 to 10 rep max, and that's what they started off with. The leg extension was a 10 to 12 rep max. Now, throughout the training period, if participants exceeded that loading range, because remember, they weren't constrained to a certain number of reps. They had their 8 to 10 rep max load on the leg press, and they terminated their sets when they believed to be at 2 RIR. Now, if someone got to 11 or 12 reps, I added load, and people were responding pretty well in the first few weeks. And so I was adding 5 kilos at a time on the leg press, and looking back, maybe I should have added 2.5 kilos to the leg press to try and reduce the exposure to such heavy loading over quite a short period of time. So that's something that I'll be looking to do in the second round that will be commencing soon to try and mitigate the chances of these niggles and potential injuries arising. And this is another interesting talking point. So, load was progressed through the 8 weeks, as I described. And Steve, you might ask, well, what if the participants didn't get to the rep range that we were kind of shooting for, the 8 to 10 rep max range or the 10 to 12 rep max range? What if they were fatigued and they only did 6 reps or 5 reps? Did I drop the load? And the answer to that is no, because that's a byproduct of fatigue. So what I was trying to investigate here was the effect of RIR, right, or the effect of proximity to failure on rep performance across sets as well, right? So yes, load was progressed, was increased if participants exceeded that range, but across sets, if their reps dropped off, I didn't make a change because that's simply a byproduct of fatigue. So with that in mind, across the 8-week period, we can then zoom out and look at how each protocol, look at the volume load and the rep volume that each protocol achieved, right? So I didn't purposefully try to equate volume across the legs. Like I said, you stop when you've got a certain number of reps in reserve. This other leg is going to stop when it just reaches failure. And we're going to see what happens across multiple sets, which I think also has important benefits because we are interested in how fatigue, how proximity to failure not only interacts with hypertrophy, but also interacts with fatigue, because fatigue and hypertrophy may also have some sort of long-term interaction, although we do need more research to elucidate that further.
I think I'm glad I asked that question. I almost thought you were going to be like, no, super confident in everything we did. But that was actually really an interesting look into insight into things. And we did touch on it briefly because I've mentioned it a few times in some podcasts where I know you said you included the leg press and people trained to failure ended up kind of getting injured on it, which I think when you think about leg press, you think about failing on it, like it's pretty horrific, especially if you're not skilled at it. So I can see how like that could be a thing. And obviously the within subject design doing single leg was helpful, but I imagine failing single leg is a little bit, I don't know, less risky somehow because it's less load, and I'm not sure why. It just seems like it's a little bit of an easier thing to do than using both. But yeah, like you said, the interaction with fatigue is very interesting because I believe there is research looking into when you train to failure, it does impact like future sets and you can't perform as well. So the people, and looking at like how much volume did they do total, was actually trained. You'd think people train to failure, they can do like they get that extra rep or 2 reps on the exercise, but how does it impact the rest of the sessions and sets and future, like throughout the entire time? So yeah, are we allowed to talk about some of the kind of results you've achieved so far? You had some objective and subjective measures.
Yeah, totally. So I think before we get into that, it's also worth discussing another aspect of the measurement I used to specifically investigate muscle hypertrophy. Now, for some people, this may seem to be a trivial point, but in reality, it's actually quite important. And I don't think previous research has paid enough attention to the potential error in the measurement that is used to measure, right, and assess hypertrophy. So what do I mean by this exactly? Well, Steve, there's multiple measurements that we can employ to assess hypertrophy. So we have, starting at the top, MRI. That seems to be the gold standard, also very expensive. We can use DEXA scans. We can use ultrasound imaging. We can use CT scans. There's quite an array of different measures that we can employ. They all have their own margin of error, right? So the machine that you use, that specific machine, it's got a margin of error. But looking beyond that, the way the measure itself is used by the technician, the way it's administered, also comes with a potential error margin as well, right? So let me try and elaborate a little further. I decided to use ultrasound imaging to assess muscle hypertrophy, right? So basically what we're doing here is we're assessing specifically muscle thickness, right? So we're able to measure the thickness of a given muscle in centimeters. Now, Steve, imagine you were lying, on your back, supine on a bench, and I place an ultrasound probe on your thigh. The way I place that probe on your thigh, the pressure I apply, the angle at which I apply it, all these factors can influence the image that is generated on the ultrasound machine. Right now, remember, I'm looking down into the thigh. So basically, the image that is produced shows from the layer of skin all the way down to the femur, and I can measure the vastus lateralis and the rectus femoris that way, the muscle thickness, right? So what I did to take care of any potential concern surrounding error in the measurement was the addition of 2 baseline assessments, right? So in that first week, that familiarization week before the 8-week training study commenced, I took 2 baseline assessments of muscle thickness. So Steve, if I was to measure the muscle thickness of your quads today, and again in 48 hours, there should technically be hardly any differences, right? It should be basically the same. Obviously, there's going to be some minor differences, but they should be very similar. If they're not very similar, then the error margin, right, the potential error in the measurement is quite large, and that's a confounding factor for study results, right? And oftentimes, research studies only employ the one baseline measure, so they can't actually calculate their own typical error value, right? So the typical error value basically indicates the potential error in the measurement. And again, this is not a trivial point because this simply solidifies the results that we're obtaining from the study even further. So for example, Steve, my typical error value was 0.1 centimeters, right? So 1 millimeter. So that was like the variance, almost, we could think of it as the variance seen between the the two baseline assessments. So any increases in muscle thickness greater than 1 millimeter are unlikely to be due to measurement error, right? So I can confidently state that. If we see an increase in muscle thickness that's less than a millimeter, I can't actually say whether that's due to hypertrophy or due to randomness and error in the measurement. So I'm hoping that makes sense. And sometimes it's a tricky point to try and get across, and I don't hear it spoken about enough in hypertrophy research. So what some studies do, for example, Steve, is they will decide to use an ultrasound machine to assess muscle hypertrophy, and they will simply reference a typical error value that was established in another lab that also used the same ultrasound machine. But of course, it's not the same technician using the actual machine, placing it on someone's thigh and getting the measurement. So I think it's important that going forward, studies try and take ownership of that, employ the two baseline assessments, and calculate their own typical error value. Because when we get to the results, and I speak about the hypertrophy that we actually saw, I can use the typical error value as a reference point to adjust how confident I am in the results that I'm seeing actually being due to hypertrophy instead of just error in the measurement. Does that make sense?
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Yeah, the way I don't know if this helps the listeners, but this is the way I have an example of kind of something that I think about it with is girth measurements for clients. Like if you're taking like an arm measurement or chest measurement very frequently, quite often the change is that you're trying to observe is smaller than the human error that is involved when you're using like just a tape measure around the arm. And if I don't know, tried to calculate that person's human error, I might be able to take that into consideration into the change that we're seeing, which is kind of my comparison to what you've done here, which I think is, again, it's not something I believe I've ever heard about either. And it makes a lot of sense because I hear about like the fact if you're using like a DEXA, for example, like it's important to use the same machine and under like the same conditions because different machines, I guess, have these error rate differences. And so you can't be sure the other machine that you're on is giving you a different report, but how does that compare to this, I guess, other machine here? So I think that's a really important and great point to make.
Yeah, so like intuitively, you already seem to know that, but like you said, you'd never really come across it in discussions or via reading research. So again, this is something that will be reported in the paper. As I start the second round of data collection, I'm going to continue employing these measures to calculate the most accurate typical error value. And, hopefully everyone, experiences hypertrophy and we can confidently say that it is hypertrophy and it's not due to potential error like I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, fantastic. I guess we can dig into maybe some of the results that you've got so far.
Yeah, I think before we get to the specific results, we should probably just touch on statistical analysis for a bit of time because we spoke about this in the last podcast, Steve. We spoke about how, I believe I spoke about how previous research has employed an approach where two different groups are obviously compared, and a p-value is calculated to indicate whether a potential difference between the two groups is statistically significant or not. Now, when people read that there is no statistical significance, or at least from, again, conversations I've had and the observations I've made, that sometimes leads them to think that, okay, well, we just shouldn't care about them. There's no difference. And I think in the past, that's where people have been led to think that, well, there's no statistical difference between training to failure and non-failure, right, in these individual studies. And so we don't need to train to failure at all. And I don't think that is the right interpretation to be making, because even if there is no statistical difference between two groups, there could still be some practical importance to that difference. Now, I'm not saying that significance testing shouldn't be used. I think it has merit in certain circumstances. I used it in the meta-analysis that I conducted last year, but I didn't solely rely on the p-value to come to my interpretations, right? In that meta-analysis, at no point did I say that you shouldn't train to failure because there is no statistical difference, right? We did indeed find no statistical difference between training to failure and being just short of failure. But if you're looking at the effect sizes, for example, the effect sizes did favor pushing to failure in some instances. They were just trivial. They were quite minor, and that's why they weren't statistically different. Now, in this study design, or in this study, I'm taking a slightly different approach to statistical analysis, and I'm using what's known as Bayesian analysis. So earlier in this conversation, I mentioned how when we're looking at research findings and this new study comes out and we read the findings, we need to also take into account our prior information, right? The prior information we have from all the other studies that there are out there, and our prior knowledge. So basically what we're doing is we're combining prior knowledge with the given data and trying to come to a conclusion. And Bayesian analysis is basically doing that, right? So with Bayesian analysis, we're more focused on probabilities, right? So instead of saying, well, training to failure is better than non-failure, or vice versa, and full stop, we're saying, well, what is the probability that training to failure is better than non-failure, or vice versa? So looking more so at probabilities. And with Bayesian analysis, we can actually inject prior information into the analysis to take into account not just the given data that we have, right, from this study, for example, but we can also consider that data in the context of, for example, previous meta-analytic results, right? And that provides us with a much clearer picture of how things may play out. So I think that it's important to plant that seed going into a discussion of the results here, because I'm not specifically looking at statistical differences between the two protocols, right? So I do have some preliminary findings, and I will be posting some of the preliminary findings on social media, almost like a social media preprint, if you will. And it's been very interesting to get these 9 participants through the study and take their final ultrasound scans. And, people might be thinking, well, it's only 9 participants, right? Like that's not enough participants. And look, the more participants, the better in all situations. It is quite hard, though, to recruit a lot of participants, and I am, in the process of recruiting more and getting my full sample size. But the one thing to consider here is that usually the critiques surrounding sample size are specific to what is known as statistical power, which I want to briefly make a point about. So, for example, if I recruited 10 participants and I put 5 in one group, 5 in the other. And at the end of the study, one group did seem to be a little better than the other, right? So they maybe gained a little more muscle. So group A gained a little more muscle than group B. If I was to run a significance test, I'd probably find no statistical difference because the sample size is low. But if, for example, I had 10 participants in each group or 15 in each group, I'd probably get a significant p-value, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that the sample size is closely tied to statistical significance, right? But with Bayesian analysis, the estimates we get from Bayesian analysis are valid independent of the sample size. And I think that's a really crucial point here, because again, I'm stepping away from looking at p-values. So it's not like I need a specific sample size to try to achieve a given p-value. And again, I'm hoping that is making sense as well. And of course, once data collection is complete, we'll have a much clearer picture as to how things play out. But at the moment, it's the first round that has involved 9 participants. So basically what I've found upon taking the post study measures of muscle thickness is that everyone experienced some degree of muscle hypertrophy, which is great. And basically what I did here was I combined the hypertrophy experience in the rectus femoris and the vastus lateralis to provide a complete measure of muscle hypertrophy. And both legs actually grew by about 3 millimeters, right? 3 millimeters each. Doesn't sound like much, right? But that's the total hypertrophy that was experienced. And it was very similar. If we calculate the percentage change from baseline, the fail leg experienced a 6% increase in hypertrophy, and the RIR leg a 5.8% increase in hypertrophy. So again, very similar between the two protocols. Of course, there was some individual variability where some people gained a little more in the RIR leg, others gained a little more in the failure leg. We're talking about very minor differences here, but that's how things looked on average. Now, is inspection of mean differences enough to come to confident and concrete conclusions? Probably not. And that's why we have statistical analysis, right? So with the Bayesian analysis, what we're doing now is we're creating what are known as posterior distributions for each of the protocols. So Steve, you might be familiar with like a bell curve that sometimes shows like a normal distribution. Basically, the Bayesian analysis spits one of those curves out for each of the protocols to indicate the probability of experiencing a certain degree of muscle hypertrophy, right? So now we have a few things to look at, and this will be posted on my Instagram soon. So feel free to check it out if you're listening along and you want to see how this visually looks. Steve, I know you have some of the images that I sent through. What we can look at here is we can compare the distributions for the fail limb and the RIR limb, and we can look at the mean, right? How similar is the mean? We can look at how similar the credible intervals are. You might have heard the term confidence intervals in Bayesian analysis. We're looking at credible intervals, which are a little different. They allow us to provide direct statements about probability. So we're comparing the mean, right? The central tendency of the mean, the credible interval, and then the distribution itself. And what I'm seeing so far is I'm seeing some pretty even overlap between the distributions. The means are roughly in line. The credible intervals are also very similar, which, to summarize all that, the hypertrophy that I'm seeing so far across the limbs is very similar. Right, so this evidence indicates that it is possible to experience as much hypertrophy as you would experience training to failure with an RIR-based approach, at least over the course of 8 weeks, obviously considering the parameters of the program design that I implemented, right? Because proximity to failure isn't the only variable that is influencing the stimulus achieved, right? We're looking at exercises, volume, rest periods, etc. But given the parameters of the program design, the length of the study, that's what we're seeing at this point in time. Again, after the data collection is complete, things may look a little different, but that's how things are looking like now.
Awesome, Martin. One thing actually, just to throw back to something you were mentioning before, just I don't, because it might come into the rest of our discussion here, was you mentioned the niggles and things that people are experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
Was that specific towards like the failure leg, or was it specific to just individuals? It didn't really matter if it was RAR or failure leg.
Yeah, so that's a great question. The one injury that the participant had to drop out because so one participant dropped out, and the injury that they experienced was in the RIR leg, so that was a strain. And that's something I think I can explain. So, and again, this is something that I'm going to do a little differently in the second round. But Steve, you can imagine coming into a study, having to increase your range of motion, for example, having to train harder. There's a few, this individual was also completing quite a high amount of volume. So they came into the study with a high volume. I increased their range of motion because I thought they could go lower than what they were doing in their own training, right? They were probably pushing harder than they were in their own training. So a few factors there leading to the potential injury. We've actually implemented a rule now to try and mitigate this going forward. If an individual is recruited and in the previous months they've been doing more than 15 sets for their quads, we're actually going to drop that off by 20% to try and mitigate any potential injury risk and just limit participant burden in general, because this one participant the sessions were grueling. I'll just leave it there. And eventually, it was just too much to handle. So this happened in the first couple of weeks, but there were grueling sessions. And I think it's just a combination of all these factors coming together. So something to consider there. And then throughout the study, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. I do have them. They will be reported. The failure leg did experience more niggles and complaints than the RIR leg, but we're not talking about major differences here, maybe 3 versus 2. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. That's something that will be reported in the paper, but nothing that really stands out between the legs so far. Again, both legs were training pretty hard, and it's a combination of factors that kind of comes into play that leads to the niggles and potential injuries that we're seeing here.
Cool. Yeah, if anything, I guess I was thinking maybe the failure leg would get a little bit more, but to think that they were similar, that's also like completely believable as well. So makes sense. And I guess going into this, people who had that, maybe your previous like scope and review and meta-analysis in mind, they're looking at the results and being like, that makes sense because that's kind of what your meta-analysis said. Whereas other people looking at the meta-regression and thinking, hey, like I thought failure was meant to be better, and here maybe, well, it was like the tiniest bit better, but very, very comparable. Was there any differences? I know you didn't just measure muscle growth, you measured some other like fatigue outcomes. Was there any differences within that were particularly interesting?
Yeah, so before we move on, I've got the exact numbers here. So the amount of complaints, if you will, about niggles that I observed throughout the 8-week period, for the failure leg, that's sitting at around 4. So 4 complaints, whether that's groin, quad, glute, and then 2 complaints for the RIR leg plus the injury, right? So we're looking at 4 versus 3 across the intervention period. Again, that's something that's going to be reported. It's interesting when I was conducting the study, especially in the early stages when people were complaining about these niggles. I was thinking about how previous research studies have been conducted, whether other researchers have had these problems when pushing participants to failure, but I don't really know because it's just not reported. So again, I'm going to be explicit about as many things as I possibly can be explicit about to give the reader the most complete understanding of what actually went down during the study period, because some of the sessions were grueling, especially in the first few weeks when people were acclimatizing to the stimulus in general. Again, we can't just look at that as proximity to failure, right? I changed some individuals' range of motion. Their volume stayed the same. They started training a little bit harder than they were, pushing to failure. Few things going on here that would have influenced some of the complaints and whatnot. So hopefully that makes sense. In regards to some of the other measures, so I did make an effort to not only look at fatigue, but also perceptual responses, right? So responses like perceived discomfort, perceived exertion, general feelings as well, right? So I haven't statistically analyzed these other outcomes yet. I'm still in the process of doing that. But looking at mean differences just between each of the protocols, in all cases, the failure leg experienced more discomfort, slightly more exertion as well, so RPE, so session RPE, and general feelings were more negative on average for the failure leg, especially in the final week of the study. So this is also a very novel and interesting point. What I did, Steve, to measure these outcomes was I did it at several time points throughout the study. So we didn't measure perceived discomfort and exertion and general feelings every week. I did it on week 1, week 4, and week 8, right? So we've got 3 different time points. Like I said, failure seemed to always be a bit higher in regards to discomfort post-set, right? So discomfort was assessed post-set. So as soon as a participant did their set, I'd ask them what their perceived discomfort was. When it comes to perceived exertion, that assessment was taking place after the individual had finished their training protocol on the one leg. Now, this is important because the way the sessions were designed, they were designed in a way to allow us to make these assessments without the other leg being a confounder, right? So, for example, Steve, if you were part of the study, you'd come in and you'd be randomly allocated to maybe starting with your failure leg, and you do all your training on the failure leg before going to the RIR leg, right? So you do the leg press, leg extension on your failure leg. I'd get the perceived exertion rating after you finished your failure leg, and then we'd move on to the RIR leg, right? Now, once the RIR leg had finished its training, I wouldn't ask you about perceived exertion then, and I wouldn't even ask you about perceived discomfort, because that might be confounded by the fact you've already trained your failure leg. So we only took these assessments for the first leg that was trained in each session.
Very
right?
Good.
So, you come in twice a week, Steve. We take your assessments of the failure leg on the first session. Second session, you come in, you start with RIR, and we take your assessments for the RIR leg, right? Now, what I found was that in week 8, for the general feelings, and this is basically me asking you, how do you generally feel, right? You've got a scale that goes from -5 to +5. 0 is neutral, so you feel the same as you did upon walking into the gym. Negative numbers mean bad feelings, literally. So you got bad, fairly bad, very bad, and then the opposite for positive numbers being, good, very good, etc. And in week 1 and week 4, things were pretty even between the failure and RIR legs. Some people are actually feeling pretty good after training to failure and RIR. Like, it was just, it wasn't that much of a burden. Yes, it was hard, but it's not like it made them feel bad. So, the exertion would have been high, but it's not like they were flattened after each of the sessions. But in week 8, at this point, everyone's pretty much had a negative feeling for their failure leg, whereas the RIR has been slightly neutral, if not still in the positive range. And this is something that I subjectively started to observe towards the end of the study. Pretty much all the participants, in that week 6 to week 8 period were starting to not necessarily complain, but speak to me about how the fatigue they were feeling was starting to bleed into some of their other sessions, right? They were starting to feel demotivated. Some people stopped doing their hamstring training after their quadricep training with me. So some of the guys would, do their quad training with me, the study protocols, and then go off and do hamstring. Some people were starting to skip their hamstring work. So towards the end of the 8-week period, generally things were starting to become, perceptually negative, and that was showcased so far, has been showcased in some of my subjective assessments as well. So it's pretty interesting to see the effect of numerous weeks, strung together, as opposed to just acute sessions. So again, this is in many of the previous research studies, these measures aren't taken. So we don't really have these insights into how the participants actually felt going through the study, right? Is that making sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, because I mean, I just think about training to failure for 8 weeks with like my current like quad volume. That does sound pretty horrific, to be honest.
Yeah.
I get you were looking at performance, weren't you? So did the kind of perceived bad feelings also align with like drops in performance towards the end, or were they still able to perform despite that? Do you have that?
So at this point, all I can say is that, and this comes back to a point I raised earlier. I mentioned that I didn't purposefully equate volume between the protocols, right? Because I wanted to see how volume would pan out. And so far, if we're looking at volume load, right? So sets times reps times load, and rep volume, which is just sets times reps, across the 8 weeks, the volume across both protocols has been roughly the same, right? So they've been able to achieve roughly the same volume. So, Steve, if fatigue wasn't a thing, if that didn't exist, right? In an ideal world, no fatigue, the failure leg should be accumulating more volume, right? Both volume load and rep volume, because it's doing the leg is doing more reps per set. But because of fatigue, right, things seem to even out across the 8 weeks. So the volume is roughly the same. Again, that's going to be reported in the paper, along with some measures of fatigue that we're also taking, which again, I haven't analyzed yet. And I'll also be reporting the decrease in reps that participants were experiencing across the 8 weeks as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like you said, we were talking about it earlier in terms of like the fatigue that failure brings and the impact on volume and how that could play into things and maybe be important. So I don't know, maybe I'm kind of thinking at the start, the failure group are maybe managing to get that more volume, but now the accumulated fatigue's hitting them towards the end, and whereas the other group are just maintaining it more readily throughout the entire time because they're holding on to less accumulated fatigue. So really, really interesting stuff. Did you have any other kind of outcome measures that you wanted to talk about, or move on to like any practical? Are you ready to talk about any practical recommendations from this? Do you have anything that this has changed for you?
Yeah, I think that's the crux of the study itself so far. And I think really most of the attention needs to be placed on the design of the study and the elements of the study that I think make it quite a robust study. If we're really trying to investigate and examine the influence of RIR on hypertrophy, there's nothing else that specifically springs to mind that needs to be touched on. But I think when it comes to practical applications, like I mentioned earlier, we shouldn't just be looking at one study to make those practical applications. So I think at this point, the past 2 years have been really elucidating in the sense that a lot of research has come out that I've obviously been involved in that has provided us with some important insights. The recent meta-regression shows that the trajectory, right, is there in as sets are terminating close to failure. Hypertrophy seems to increase. Things are likely trivial towards the end there, right, towards that failure point. At this point, my study is showing that things are pretty similar, right, towards the top end of that relationship as we get close to failure. Obviously, things may change. I don't think that one specific study should necessarily change your mind, right? Rather, it should push you in one direction or another, closer to your original thoughts, right, or further from your original thoughts. And the way things are panning out, for me, the research is starting to reinforce the idea that pushing close to failure is important for hypertrophy. It's reinforcing that idea. It's more important for hypertrophy than it is for strength, right? In the past, I may have recommended keeping yourself within like 3 reps of failure on average. At this point, especially with the results of my study coming through, it's looking more like 2, because this is the first study now where we're getting participants to keep their RIR constant across sets, predict their RIR. I happen to prescribe a 2 RIR. And so at this point, the strike zone for me, the hypertrophy strike zone, is looking at, looking like 2 reps shy from failure. So if you're keeping most of your training within that strike zone, you're likely going to be experiencing close to optimal hypertrophy. Something to keep in mind, though, Steve, is that all the participants that I recruited, they all had trained to failure in the past, right? So that's something you have to consider here. You have to consider how this might look across someone's whole training journey, right? So failure does have to be a part of that at some point, or else, you're not really going to know how close to failure you actually are when you're predicting 2 reps in reserve, for example. But considering we also know that the trajectory, right, again, it's pointing in the direction of more hypertrophy being experienced as sets terminate close to failure, well, we should probably implement some failure training when the cost doesn't outweigh the benefit, right? And this is something I spoke about in my meta-analysis last year as well in the practical applications section, right? On the last set of an exercise, on exercises that aren't as fatiguing, we also need to consider the features of the exercise, whether it's emphasizing the lengthened portion of the rep, for example, or the shortened position. There's a whole host of other factors that come into play that I think need to be considered when you're coaching an individual. So research is only going to be able to tell us so much. And as a coach, right, from a coach's perspective, I'm trying to obtain clues from all these studies and from my experiences and my knowledge in general to try and create a program for a client that gets them to where they need to be. Some individuals will require more sets to failure than others might. And that's where my thoughts, stand at this point. It's not that they have changed per se. It's just that this research is reinforcing the importance of pushing close to failure. But do we have to reach failure on every set to maximize muscle hypertrophy? At this point, I dare say likely not, right? But it should probably be part of the overall program design in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's very well stated. It's kind of like if the best place to be is just before your limits, how do you know where that is if you've never gone to your limits? Like, you have to experience that at some point to kind of have that rough gauge. And I guess what would be really interesting, and you might already be thinking about this in future, is like a third group that maybe we're at like a 3 and a 2 RR, or maybe even like a 4 and a 3 RR, and how much did they experience less growth, or like, and what's their fatigue? And it's super interesting stuff. And like you said, this study, despite just being one study, to me, it's the best one we have looking at this. And so we have like lots of like quantity of data versus like, this is what, like you said, in a meta-analysis, this wouldn't be weighed any more heavily. So it gets maybe lost in the mix a little bit, but it's actually very powerful because of all the controls you put in place. And I guess, obviously, it's only looking at the quads, but there's no reason, I guess you'd agree, there's no reason to believe that relationship wouldn't be the same for if you trained a different muscle group. I guess you don't know. We don't know. And you had males and females. That's one thing that wasn't mentioned. You had males and females, didn't you?
Yeah. So that's another important point. Most of the previous research has been conducted in males. And I've made a large effort over the past year or so to recruit both males and females in my research. The data set I'm currently speaking about involves 8 males and 1 female, but in the second round of data collection, I have many other females already recruited, so the numbers should even up. And I hope my research, at the end of the day, my goal is to improve the standard of exercise science research, and I hope the explicit reporting in the paper and the methods that I've used can inspire future studies to take similar approaches and hopefully investigate this concept even further. Like you said, Steve, it'd be great to have more of these more research studies similar to what I'm describing today. Because could you imagine in a few years' time, if we did have 2, 3, 4 similar studies with similar designs, and we conducted another meta-analysis, the picture that we're painting here would only be a lot clearer, and we'd have a lot more confidence in the claims and the statements that we can derive from research, right? At the end of the day, the credence that we award a given study finding has to be adjusted based on the uncertainties surrounding the data, the limitations of the research, right? And I'm hoping going forward, the quality of these studies only improves. And again, that's the point of the attention that I place on the methods, right? We spoke a lot today about just the methods, which ironically, Steve, is probably the part of the paper that is least read, right? You got the introduction, you got the methods, you got the discussion and the conclusion. I don't know what the stats are on this. I don't think we have stats, but I dare say most people read the intro, right? Probably skip most of the methods and get to the good bits at the end. And I think if you're interested in research and you listen to podcasts about research and you're interested in reading a paper, don't be afraid to read the method section, even if you might not immediately understand it, right? And I think this is a really important concept, because I think with social media, being a large part of information transfer and the dissemination of research these days, it's quite easy to just get lost in what you see in social media, and you might think that there's no point of reading the whole paper because you're getting most of the details on social media. But the way I see it is, I see this information landscape that we're creating, where a research paper gets published, and this landscape is made up of many peaks and valleys, and the research paper is right at the top. It's the peak, right? Now, that's as accurate as the information can get because it's in its original form. Now, social media digests that information, right? Chews it up, spits it out. We then have basically a bunch of information fragments just scattered across the landscape, right? So we're now going from a peak into this valley. I call it the valley of information despair, because people are reading these bits and pieces, right, that come from the original source, but they lack the detail, the nuance, the clarity that is required to truly understand, right, what the original document is putting forth. And I think that is a problem in this day and age. And this is why these podcasts are so important, because these podcasts come out and they form another peak in the information landscape. But unfortunately, because of the delay between the podcast release, right, and the initial release of a paper or an article, whatever it might be, a lot of people are stuck in that valley of information despair. And the problem, Steve, is that it's quite hard from there to climb back up to a peak, right? To climb back up to the peak, you got to read the paper, right? You have to listen to a 2-hour podcast. Good thing is podcasts are becoming readily available, and people are willing to listen to them. But it takes time, and effort. And a lot of people
Yeah.
get trapped in that valley of information despair. And, the content that they see on social media, it seemingly represents the original document. But in fact, like I said before, it may lack some of the nuance, the detail, and and discussion of the uncertainties that are actually embedded in the data, right? The uncertainties that are baked in that data set that we haven't addressed yet. And this goes for many topics in exercise and nutrition science, and even beyond that. So, what I'm trying to say here is that if you do get your information from social media, you have to be somewhat, you have to consider that it may not map on to the original document that was actually put forth because of the way social media basically chews it up and spits it out. So hopefully that makes sense. And, what I'm saying here is you got to do some research on your own. You have to be willing to listen to podcasts, read papers, read the methods. And I think this is why we have to put trust in science communicators that, do play a role. Like if you're interested in research and you want to know more about it, put your trust in science communicators who are involved in research and who are trying their best to not only put out a good, piece of work, but then also contribute to podcast discussions like this, which are really invaluable in the information landscape.
I think that was really well said. And this information valley of despair, I mean, it's horrific, but it's so true, because it's also the type of like the social media posts that do well are the clickbaity ones, the ones that jump to conclusions, the one that just like gives you the TDLR and you don't actually need to go away and read it and understand it or anything. And then, like you said, someone's read that, it's confirmed maybe a bias or it's changed their mind, and then they're kind of done. Whereas I've definitely learned with my time of like reading science and talking to people that there is never a jump to conclusion, especially if your thoughts were over here and suddenly people are saying, no, they should be all the way over here. And this was really well considered before. Like you're not suddenly like jumping into this different ship. So I think that's very well said. And I really I'm thankful to be able to talk to people like yourself, Martin, and thankful for someone like yourself who is so willing to take the time and effort to not only do this research, but then put in the time and effort to really explain to the audience why like some things are like the way you've done it and the way you want to go in future. And then also how to hopefully use this as an individual to help your own training and kind of with your clients' training or what have you. So yeah, very well explained. And thank you so much for taking the time. I think people are going to really enjoy this and enjoy this paper. I'm interested to see other people's takes on it and how that, if it goes into the valley of despair, but hopefully you avoid it.
Well, I will try and avoid it. I will post the post that I'm planning on posting on Instagram will be posted a little closer to the release date of this podcast. And that is the exact thought process that I'm implementing here, is I'm going to try and make the post and hopefully have a long form discussion released in the days after, to avoid that delay between peak to peak. Right now, we can't always do that because these podcast discussions take time to set up and get edited and whatnot. But I'm going to try my best to keep people as well informed as possible, because at the end of the day, Steve, there's no social media post that I could make that could do this discussion justice, and that could do my work any justice, or that could do the meta-aggression and the meta-analyses any justice, right? That can't take place on social media. So I think when you're looking at updating your coaching or your training philosophy, you need to be careful where you're downloading your information from. So you want to be open to making an update to your coaching philosophy, no doubt about that. So you don't want to be the person who's always clicking, not now, when the update message pops up on your laptop. You're always clicking not now, not now. You want to be willing to click on update but you want to be in control of how fast you're downloading the information, and you need to be smart about where you're downloading that information from, right? Personally, I don't really download information from social media that I intend to influence my coaching philosophy, right? I might see bits and pieces here and there, and if I'm interested in something, I might click remind me later, right? And I'll do some further reading. I'll wait for a podcast discussion to come out because I want to hear someone's complete position on a topic. I want to hear a long form discussion, or I want to read a paper or read a book before I make an update to my coaching philosophy, right? I'm thinking about how my philosophy is going to stand its ground over the next 5 to 10 years, not just the next few months, right? I want to have an anti-fragile philosophy that, gets good results, right? But I don't want to deviate abruptly from that philosophy just because this new study has been released and it shows these specific findings, and, we're going to now take these findings at face value. That's not the approach I want to have when it comes to updating my philosophy. And I'd suggest people take a similar kind of approach mentally when they're thinking about whether or not they should change things in their own training or their coaching philosophy with their clients if they're a coach. Like I said, you have to be open to updating or else you'll be left behind. But if you update too soon, right, you update overnight just because a new study has come out, right? It might work in the short term, that update might work in the short term, but it could be faulty and it might corrupt the rest of your coaching philosophy. So you need to download information slowly over time, and you need to be smart about where you're downloading that information from to make the update.
That analogy, I don't know if you've used it before, but it's so perfect. I know how clunky and slow my computer gets when I haven't given it an update. So it's so true. And I absolutely agree. I think it's unfortunate in some ways where like science has now become like a marketing tool, and people like are posting out like studies and like their interpretations of it maybe too soon in some instances, and they're trying to say that they like have the secret or whatever. And I can imagine coaches, and I've definitely been there, where I feel like, oh, I'm getting left behind, I've got to update whatever I'm doing here. It's like, well, if you already have a well thought out kind of system, like you said, don't kind of get scared because one new study's come out. Just kind of digest it, read it, take your time before, and then it can mold what you're already doing. Because like you said, you don't want to be that person just never updating, because then that's just dogma that's not going to be, it's going to be slow and not efficient and productive.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think providing your philosophy is getting you progress or getting your clients progress, you need to be able to trust in it. And you need to be able to diagnose whether it's actually, what you're doing is actually having an effect. If you change things overnight, right, it's going to be much harder to diagnose whether the changes you're making, the reason that, well, you don't know if you make too many changes overnight because of a study, right? How can you diagnose which change is actually leading to the effect you're going to see in the coming months, right? So I think diagnostics are an important part of the coaching process, and it takes time to diagnose whether what you're doing is working. So you have to trust in it. If it's working, you got to trust in it. You have to download information slowly to make tweaks here and there. And Steve, the reality is that you could always potentially be making better progress, right? But you just don't know that. Like maybe all you need to do is add a couple extra sets to your quads, right? And maybe that's what you're missing out on. Maybe it's 2 extra sets that's going to give you, a significant amount of growth, but you don't know that. The best you can do is try to move closer in that direction over time by applying new knowledge, testing things out, etc. And I think, from my observations, and I work with a lot of coaches, we've got Cert 3 and 4 students at JPS, we've got mentorship students, I've got students that I mentor, we've got coaches at JPS, right? I observe a lot of coaches, and the most proficient and the most successful on the gym floor are the ones that don't deviate abruptly from their coaching philosophy, right? They hold their ground. They ask me about research findings here and there, but they're not really looking to make these massive changes. They just want to stay in the loop, and they know what they're doing is working. They've got a good system that's working well, that's based in what we currently know, based in their experiences, based in what they're seeing in their clients. And, I know so many coaches who are doing such a great job with their clients, influencing people on the gym floor, changing people's lives. And, they're the ones who aren't caught up in the social media, news flashes that we see pretty much on a daily basis. So, hopefully people can take something away from that.
For sure. Martin, thank you so much for your time. Again, this has been a great chat. It's a fantastically run study. I'm very excited to, again, see people's responses to it. And hopefully people will listen to this and take the appropriate action moving forward. If people want to keep up to date with yourself, they want to see this post, where should they head?
Yeah, so you can catch me on Instagram, mrfitness with a _. You'll see that post by the time this podcast is out. It'll be there. You can also follow the JPS education pages. I play a large role in the education services that JPS provides, and I'm always after feedback on pretty much anything, whether it's science communication, whether it's the study design itself. So if you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out. Let me know what you think, and I take all of that feedback into account.
Thank you so much, Martin, and we'll catch you guys next time.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut Movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut Movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.